Ahoy! Next patch, crafting best in slot, both for armor and weapons, is going to be easier and cheaper in a lot of ways, and I'd like to talk about those. There are some outlier situations where it's still not cheaper or where it's actually getting more expensive, but generally speaking, there are a lot more options now, and I want to go into that in detail. We're going to look at New World database here, as well as nwmarketprices.com, in order to get all this information so that we know the full drop tables, the craft tables, so we know the exact chances to get things. We're going to use Shadewalker Mask as an example here. This applies to any other armor that is crafted the same way as well, except shoes, which have no secondary high chance roll perk, unlike all the other armor pieces, but I think showing the mask here is more representative of how most pieces roll, so that's what we're going to focus on. The currently generally agreed upon best in slot is usually Resilient as your main perk, along with Shirking Fortification, and then usually either an ability perk like a weapon perk or Freedom. Outliers exist, but this is what most people are focusing on. There are two ways to currently craft this. If we look at the current patch here on the live version, and we look at our crafting options and look at the perk buckets here, then you can see that we have a 14% chance to roll Resilient, and we can, for example, lock in Resilient. That's our one perk that we can lock with the Scarab, and then we take our second perk, in this case Shirking Fortification. This could be two craft mods that we're using, and now we're rolling for Freedom, and we have like a 7% chance to get Freedom. Though some of the other perks here may also be useful. For example, if you're in Heavy, then Refreshing Ward could be your best in slot. If you're in Light, you could prefer Refreshing as well. It all depends on what exactly your best in slot is, but either way, you have a decent chance to get a good piece of gear in different ways. Well, I should say decent chance if you roll 600 gear score, because if you don't roll 600 gear score, it's pretty much almost worthless. And here you can see the whole list of all the other perks, which all roll with a 0.28% chance. But this is not the only way you can approach this. You can also, for example, say I'm rolling Shirking Fortification and Freedom together, and now your chance to roll Resilient is 20%. So if you roll 600 gear score, you will now have a roughly 20% chance to actually get your best in slot, if that is Resilient, Freedom, and Shirking Fortification. Now, on the current patch, that means we need our piece for Resilient here, which is the chunk of Consecrated Iron. That is very easy to get because you can just buy it from your faction shop, so people running PvP missions are going to get quite a few of those anyways, usually put some on the trading post to make extra gold, and they sell for relatively cheap because they are very accessible, so no problem here. Shirking Fortification, on the other hand, not so nice. You need Squirming Vines in order to get that, and Squirming Vines are terrible in terms of drop table, because you can only get them from chests in the depth and in Reekwater, and as far as I'm aware, it doesn't drop from the mutated depth version at all, or if it does drop, then with an incredibly low chance, but I don't think the chest that you get at the end of the mutated expedition is even included here. So basically, you can only get this from farming chests in Reekwater, which is extremely annoying, and most people don't do that, therefore these are very expensive. If we look at New World market prices, then we can see the price here roughly a month ago was 12,000 gold for these, and that's already a low price. You can see that it's dropping down now because people have figured out that this is actually not going to be worth anything next patch, and there was a recent higher drop chance through the daily event that we had for a bit. But if this was still valuable, if this was still useful, then the price wouldn't have gone down nearly as much. So you could just roll with Resilient, Shirking Fortification and hope for any decent third perk, and that would have mainly been affected in terms of price by Shirking Fortification, which is a lot of money. It used to be like 12,000 gold plus for a single roll. Or you could say, I want to gamble in a more extreme way, I guess, but if I get lucky, then I get really lucky with the Freedom option. Now, if you do the Freedom option, you have around 20% chance to roll Resilient, you need the piece for Freedom as well. That is Shard of Consecrated Iron. This is an extremely weird drop table with like a lot of beast mobs, a lot of low level mobs, but then also content level 46 plus, but then some of them are level 60, so there are some mobs that can generally drop it in higher level areas, but it's definitely not a super frequent drop, and it's a very weird drop table with not too much of a high chance, to be honest. And therefore, if we look at the price, we're looking at around 12,000 gold at the moment still on the same server, and sometimes higher. And I expect this price might actually go up with the next patch, because this might be the bottleneck for a lot of crafting. But if you rolled this way, you would usually spend at least 20 to usually 30,000 gold for all the materials that you need to craft a single piece of gear, and then obviously it was a massive gamble to actually get something good. Now, in the new patch, we have a better option. We still want Resilient, we don't necessarily need to lock it, but it's one of the pathways, and for most people, the second best in slot in terms of armor will be Elemental Aversion. As such, we want to have the craft mod for Elemental Aversion. And that craft mod are Armor Fragments. Now, Armor Fragments also drop from mobs, but they are much easier to find. You can see here already, it's 130 pages of drop tables, and this is just all corrupted mobs. I'm pretty sure that literally every corrupted mob in the game, no matter who, can drop this. And it's not that hard to get, because if you farm any named corrupted mobs, you will get quite a few of those relatively quickly. And some name corrupted mobs are also often farmed because of things like, for example, the corrupted trophy. So generally you will be able to get these in various ways, and there's not going to be any scarcity of these compared to many of the other resources that have weirder drop tables. This is also reflected in the current price. Even though people have figured out by now that Elemental Aversion is going to be likely best in slot, the price has hardly gone up. It's gone up from basically nothing to around 100 gold now, with some spikes here around 200 gold. But I don't think it is going to go significantly higher than that, just based on the fact that it is so easy to farm that if you were to get the price much higher, then people would just farm it and sell it, and then the price would go down again anyways. And this is an incredibly cheap roll. You can now roll Resilient and Elemental Aversion for a couple hundred gold at worst when it comes to the craft mods, where the other aspects of what you need to craft them are actually more expensive in comparison. I'm not saying this is perfect, by the way. I do have my thoughts on how crafting should be in general, but at least now if you leave things up to RNG, you have a very good chance to get something that you can at least sell. If you get a resilient piece with Elemental Aversion and you do it at full con, which is probably going to be the idea for most of these crafts, and you get Refreshing Ward and it's heavy, you can probably sell it. You get Freedom, you can probably sell it. Maybe even if you get Invigorated, which might be valued a little bit more now due to the reduction of Weaken especially, could also be useful. Refreshing, if it's light, is useful, and then you obviously have all the armor perks, the weapon perks, of which many are useful for someone out there if you roll con. In other words, if you get to 600 gear score, there's a very limited amount of perks that is actually just straight up bad with a high roll chance. The main ones of those obviously being the perks that are directly on the armor, like here, Critical Retribution, like the specific perks. But even if you go the other way, it's going to be a lot cheaper for you. You can say, I want to lock Elemental Aversion. Again, that craft mod is going to be relatively cheap, likely throughout the patch anyways. And then you can get something else that is exactly what you want. So say, for example, you are after Crippling Feral Rush for whatever reason. Then you lock Crippling Feral Rush, craft mod for that, and you lock Elemental Aversion, and you now have this 21% chance to roll Resilient. This is a gamble which on the previous patch was also possible, but again would have been insanely more expensive in comparison due to the price of Shirking Fortification. The only bottleneck again will be Freedom, because if you want Freedom and Elemental Aversion as well as Resilient, then not all too much is changing for you, because I expect the price for Freedom to just go up accordingly, since that will be what everyone wants and what is kind of annoying to get. But you also have to keep in mind that both Medium and Heavy will have some Freedom built in now, so they may have some less interest in getting as much Freedom on their armor in the first place, especially Heavy didn't necessarily use Freedom beforehand anyways. Now there is another outlier here, which is if you want to roll Elemental Aversion and Shirking heals, and then try to for Resilient, which gives you a lot of survivability in combination, though I generally don't value Shirking heals that highly even now. In that case you need Tonic of Tyrannus, but that is a PvP only reward, a PvP track only reward, so that can't even be bought since it's bind on pickup. So yeah, that one is kind of its own sphere, but at least it's not going to be more expensive either, because you literally cannot buy it in the first place. But that's just the armor side of things. We also have changes to the weapon side of things that not only affect weapons that are affected by Thwarting Strikes, but also other weapons. We get to the ranged weapons after. Let's begin with the melee weapons that currently benefit from grit. So Thwarting Strikes is not going to be as useful anymore because it activates while you have grit, giving you extra damage, which will no longer be on 300 strength and will instead be on 300 con. Now there are definitely going to be people that switch to 300 con and get grit that way, but I don't think that will be the majority, which is indicated by the price of drop of Ironwood sap as well. You can see that there's a very steep decline here. It started much higher than that, used to be at 4,000-ish, and now it's down to buy orders for 250. So yeah, not really that expensive anymore, not that valued anymore, because there are not that many people that want to switch to 300 con. This is obviously also nice for the people that will run 300 con, because crafting for them is also going to get cheaper through that, because there's not as much demand for drop of Ironwood sap, which is fairly annoying to farm. And now an interesting question will be, what will actually replace it instead? And the answer here is likely not that easy. The strong contenders are the different types of Whetstones. Worn Whetstone for Enchanted, Whetstone for Rogue, or Pristine Whetstone for Vicious. Now, which one exactly is preferable is depending on your weapon and playstyle. For example, on a Hatchet, you would likely want Enchanted, because most of your attacks will be basic attacks with a few exceptions, and even thrown Hatchet attacks count as Enchanted damage. Whereas some players might prefer Rogue for the extra backstab damage, but then you also have to counter Resilient with that, so yeah, pros and cons, but yeah, it's definitely flexible in that regard, for example. On the other hand, a weapon like the Great Axe would likely prefer Vicious because it already has critical damage amplifiers and this kind of plays better into it. Now, looking at the drop tables for these, the Worn Whetstone has a bit of a weird drop table, and so do the others, honestly. It seems that it drops from a variety of mutation bosses, but can also drop from a bunch of caches. But it's not necessarily something that is difficult to get by itself at level 60, because level 60 bosses drop it from expeditions. Seems like you primarily just have to farm expeditions for this. Similar things are true for Rogue as well. The Whetstone here seems to also drop from expeditions. You can see this is from the named mobs here. I'm not entirely sure if this includes the mutated version, because it's the named mob, so usually it does. But if it doesn't, then this is definitely going to be one of the more expensive ones. I generally expect this to be one of the more expensive ones as well. It can drop from some different material caches as well, though, so it's not quite exclusively from the bosses. And then the Pristine Whetstone, again similar, you have a bunch of different armaments and expedition caches this drops from, and we can once again see that it drops from various named mobs and expeditions. So generally it seems that farming expeditions will be worth it for these in general, and will also be valuable if you want to make some extra money through that, because crafters are likely going to use this. Or are they? So, looking at the weapons, we have a few where a lot will change and some where not that much will change in comparison. Longsword has a few perks that benefit from Keen, so if you want to roll for Keen, then this could be an effective change, but generally for people that don't want to roll Keen and that want to roll an actual damage perk, not that much is going to change, only that you're going to get one of the Whetstones now, which could end up being cheaper. So if you're going for Rogue, it could end up being cheaper for a while, but I think in the long run, the price might get to drop of Ironwood levels anyways, so I don't think there will be super major changes, especially if you're going for Rogue. Then another weapon that doesn't really change much is Warhammer. What changes here is the price for whatever you're going to be rolling, because I expect with Warhammer you're likely going to still be rolling drop of Ironwood Zap. You're likely still going to be rolling Thwarting Strikes because of the grid on the abilities itself, because you're not really basic attacking much with a hammer in most situations. So it could be that, in which case it would only be as much cheaper as drop of Ironwood Zap is cheaper. Or it could be something like Trench and Rend, which at least at the moment is still very cheap to buy. So it's possible that that could affect the crafting prices as well. It really depends on playstyle and what you're using it for. But I also think that hammers are going to be used less in general. But then if they're used, they're maybe also used by 300 con users more, because they have less damage now. So they would benefit from Thwarting Strikes anyways. With the Spear, we are also in a situation where I don't think that much will change. It depends a lot on what type of build you want to go with the Spear, what type of damage output you want to focus on, if you want to go for Rogue or if you are going to try something more particular. I don't think the Spear overall will benefit all that much, because as far as I'm aware, there weren't that many Thwarting Strike Spear users in the first place. With the Hatchet, I expect people will likely go Enchanted now, and if that is the case, or maybe Rogue as well, but if that's the case, it would at least be cheaper for a while. I think Enchanted especially is not going to be as competed for in terms of craft mods, because not as many weapons use it effectively, so this should be a good option. For the Greatsword, not that much changes, because most Greatsword users were rolling Trench and Strikes in the first place, so that was not really a contested perk to begin with. So yeah, nothing really significantly different here, and with the Greatsword you definitely still do not want to go for a crit playstyle. But there's a melee weapon that we definitely need to look at here that changes in that regard, which is the Great Axe, which has a 1.3 crit damage multiplier and then gets additional crit damage from the skill tree anyways. So on top of that, if you go beyond that with Vicious, you can have a 300 strength build and actually do pretty good damage. So what you want to roll, very likely, is going to be something like a chain option, whichever you want. They are very cheap to roll. In that place you could also roll attunement, but I think on Great Access for Wars chain is pretty good as well, so that's up to you, but the lock is kind of for the same thing anyways. It has the same effects, so to speak. So that's one thing you're gonna roll, likely, most of the time. And then along with that, I think a lot of players are going to roll Enfeebling Maelstrom, because that's just an extremely strong perk on your weapon, now that Fortify is nerfed and Weaken is not nerfed. So these two perks, being locked or attunement in its place, leaves you with a 22% chance to roll Vicious, and even if you don't get that, you're at Keen, which is still actually pretty decent, because the crit chance, the general crit chance, has been nerfed. So between those two, you have a 22% chance to get Best in Slot if you roll 600 gear score. Still not super easy, you need to roll 600 gear score first, but a lot easier than it used to be beforehand. This is kind of similar to how the bow already rolls, by the way, so that's maybe one of the outliers that we currently have that already benefits from this new system. With the Rapier, this is all a bit harder to generalize because it depends more on your build and playstyle. Many Rapier builds aren't even that focused on damage in the first place, but if you run a vicious Rapier build, then you end up with a similar outcome, which is actually pretty okay considering the base crit multiplier is already 1.4. For the Musket, things get weird now. I am assuming that you will still want your attunement, so we are gonna lock Chain Lightning instead, same effect, and you are very, very likely going to need accuracy, which you basically cannot roll free, so you have to lock it. Between those two, which you like essentially both cannot roll, almost, you are basically at Anji's mercy for what your last roll will be. I think Enchanted will still be the most valued option here, in which case you have a 6% chance to roll it, which is not exactly ideal. You can't lock it, so you kind of have to roll for that. Obviously you could also go for options like Kidney Jack and stuff still, that is still possible, but generally you're gonna roll a lot of Keen, a lot of Vicious, which probably not necessarily what most Musket players prefer, though I think Vicious might be okay at least, question mark. But Musket definitely not winning in terms of crafting. It may almost be worth to roll Enchanted and Accuracy and then hope that you get something half decent for the third perk instead of hoping for BiS. For the Fire Staff, not much really changes, because the Fire Staff already had very good rolls before this patch. It just didn't matter because no one was really using the Fire Staff. If you're even crafting in the first place, there are a lot of good named Fire Staffs out there. You'd probably roll your attunement here. We're gonna use this as chain again. And then you're gonna roll probably Refreshing Pillar of Fire, maybe Empowering Fireball. Depends on your exact playstyle, maybe you even go Empowering Meteor Shower, but you're probably gonna roll one of the weapon perks either way, so those are probably gonna go up in price. And then you are hoping for Vicious most of the time, which with a 25% chance is definitely not that hard to get, almost 26 here. For the Life Staff, nothing really changes because Blessed still needs to be locked, and it really just comes down to whichever your preferred weapon perk is that you're trying to roll for, along with Refreshing Move. So yeah, not much of a difference here compared to what used to be before, just because it's unaffected by any of the damage perk changes. For the Ice Gauntlet, there aren't any significant changes either, though rolling something like Keen may be a little less painful now that it generally is more valuable when some builds can actually use it effectively. For the Void Gauntlet, things should technically change because you can get Grit with 300 con now, and that applies to the Void Gauntlet since the most recent patch. However, you can't actually get Thwarting Strikes on a Void Gauntlet. It's currently not compatible with that, even though it's technically a melee weapon. So yeah, you're not going to get that. You're probably going to roll Enchanted or Vicious. But with the Void Gauntlet, rolling is pretty easy as well, because you are going to be benefiting from getting some extra crit chance as well. So if you roll a Keen piece, it's going to be good either way, just because crit is so important for the Void Gauntlet, and next patch takes some base crit chance away, so adding onto that a little bit will increase your overall effectiveness and your perks a lot, especially your cooldown reduction stuff. I don't know if there are any niche builds that run Blunderbuss Vicious these days. I'm really not up to date with that weapon, but I don't think so. So as such, I don't think much changes here either in terms of what you need for Best in Slot. For jewelry in general, not much changes in terms of crafting, though amulets may just be changed in so far that people may want to craft different things on them, mainly flame protection. So Shard of Niter might be decently easy to come by, but then again, so were the other craftable items. It was never a bottleneck in terms of things you need for it, the craft mods, but rather the overall resource, the overall cost to craft a single one and even have a chance to get something decent out of it. For rings, crafting will be even less valuable because Champion's Ring is going to be more valuable because Skin Awareness is going to be better because it provides you with extra crit chance, so this is going to be a super good option for many players now, unless you very specifically need like a slash damage increase or something. In case you aren't aware, Invigorated Punishment also applies to basic attacks, so basically this is almost the last piece of gear that you need to think about at this point, as long as you're effectively using Hardy. For earrings, nothing really changes at all as far as I'm aware. So as you can tell, there are a variety of ways in which crafting best in slot is getting cheaper. Before I leave, I'm gonna give you a little bit of a trading tip as well. I think that the weapon shards will go up in value. As you can see, these are the values for Delos right now, and you can see that the weapon shards are somewhere between 50 to 100 gold for the most part, except Frozen Weapon Shard. So these are very cheap at the moment, and obviously there's going to be a steady supply from any expedition that people are playing, so it's not like they're going to be impossible to get or anything, but I do believe that overall there will be more demand for them when people don't have to craft with drop of Ironwood sap as much, because the other resources, again, are at least at the moment much cheaper. They might increase in price, and more stabilized prices will maybe lead to the shards dropping again, but I think at least for a while the shards might become more of a bottleneck than they are right now, because right now no one's crafting. If you're interested in more trading tips, consider supporting me on Patreon, where I regularly post trading tips like this. In the next days we have a lot to talk about, for example some interesting data mining, and also some things like how you get the gear for the new expedition the best way. If you're interested in that, consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you get notified when that comes out. Thanks to my patrons for supporting this video, and thank you for watching. Sloth, out.